FruitBat, written by Maples and Mulberries, read to you by Avi is Evil. This fic is rated for general audiences. No archive warnings apply. This fic is under a lot of fandoms, but to summarize, Batman, Justice League, and DCU. Summary. After a magic battle, Bruce gets turned into a literal bat. His kids take care of him while the Justice League finds a cure. And reader's notes from me. I believe I'm posting this as a 100 subscriber special, so thank you guys for getting me to 100 subscribers on YouTube. This chapter is 4 chapters long, and it's roughly 18,000 words, but I'm going to, as a special treat, compress it all into one fic. Since it is longer, it'll probably come out shortly after I reach 100 subscribers, hopefully. And the reason I'm compressing it all into one is I believe the author originally meant to compress it into one, but then they separated it into different chapters. I don't know where I read that. I've read so many fics in the past while that I could be saying that wrong, but either way, yeah. Let me just get on with the fic then. Thank you once again. Chapter 1. Day 1. Zaps of energy left and right. The sky was an unsettling orange. There were literal pits of hell opening. The surrounding trees of the Philippine forests, whipped with some sort of magic-induced wind. Sorcerers, both on the side of the Justice League and enemies alike, shouted spells. Bruce hated these fights. Racing across the battlefield, he worked where he could, downing henchmen, smaller enemies, using his anti-magic tools where applicable, downing demons when they rose from the grounds. It would be so much simpler if they were fighting aliens. It would be less of a headache if they were fighting robots. But no, it had to be magic. Bruce fucking hated magic. Get down! Clark tackled Bruce to the ground as a zap of pure energy was fired at him. Cersei yelling in frustration at the miss. Somewhere to the left of them, Constantine cast a spell to distract her, and Diana let out a war cry as she launched herself forward into the throng. Batman, I should take you off the field. This doesn't really fit your skill set. Clark was staring as he tried to gather Bruce into a bridal carry. But Bruce was nothing if not stubborn. Yes, he hated magic fights. Yes, he would much rather be in Gotham than out of the country in this fight for the Justice League. Yes, he was going to punch someone if Constantine made one more sarcastic remark. But he was not going to stand down. Let go of me, Superman. I'm fine, he grit out, pushing the man away with a firm hand. He couldn't do so strength-wise, but Clark knew better than to try and force his hand. Clark gave him a look, one that Bruce was well familiar with. It said, "You are being unreasonable. You are being stubborn. You are being irrational. You are being Bruce." Batman, come on. You know magic messes with your tech. One wrong hit and a fireball exploded dangerously close to them, cutting him off. Debris rained down as Bruce ducked instinctively, his cape shielding him from the worst of it. I've had worse, Bruce grunted as he straightened up again, adjusting a slightly smoking gauntlet before pulling out a pair of nth metal batarangs, rarely used but effective against magical entities when one got desperate enough. He tossed one experimentally in his grip before locking eyes with Clark again. Go. Wonder Woman needs backup. Superman exhaled sharply but relented. There was no arguing when Bruce got like this. Fine. He shot into the sky just as Constantine's voice rang out nearby. Oh wow, Batsy, still standing? Colour me impressed. The magician sidestepped a demon swipe effortlessly while puffing on a cigarette like this was all some casual afternoon stroll for him, instead of literal hell erupting around them. How typical. His smirk widened at Bruce's immediate glare. That was what he did during all of these battles. Wind up Batman mid-apocalypse battle scenario. And God did it work. Because this whole thing was Constantine's fault, in the first place. Somewhere in the past year, he had a run-in with Cersei, who had found an alliance with one of Constantine's enemies from hell. And now, here they were, a magical army versus the Justice League. Be quiet. Bruce growled, before moving to take down some lower-grade magic users trying to gang up on the others. Powers and spells and tech and loud. The battlefield was alive and thrumming with energy. But Bruce didn't give up. He pushed forward, because even in his most uncomfortable element, he thrived in battle. That was until it happened. Bruce had just managed to shield Hal from a magic blast using an anti-energy net thrown into the sky like a makeshift shield. The move had required a leap, leaving him momentarily suspended in the air, unable to dodge. Cersei had seen her chance, and to get rid of this mortal meddler? A ray of purple hit Bruce head on. There had been too much chaos surrounding. No one had had time to block it. A shout of pain, and suddenly, an empty Batman suit hit the ground in a heap of Kevlar and leather. Empty. A stunned silence rippled through the battlefield. For half a second, no one moved. And then it descended into chaos. Diana roared in fury, her sword carving through the air as she lunged at Cersei with terrifying precision. Hal barely managed to yank his ring up in time to block another spell headed his way, before he was forming green cleavers. Clark's eyes burned red after scanning for heat signatures where Bruce had just been standing, and finding nothing but what he assumed was a pile of still hot ash. The constant familiar thrum of his bat's heartbeat gone silent made any mercy fall short as he went on the attack. And Constantine? His smirk was gone. Cigarette dropped from his lips as he froze mid-incantation, blue eyes darting between the discarded suit and Cersei's triumphant sneer. Something dark flickered across his face before he hissed out a curse under his breath. "Oh, you absolute idiot." No body left behind means this wasn't death. It was transformation. A magical displacement, which meant Bruce wasn't gone, just elsewhere, or possibly even reconfigured entirely, if Cersei felt particularly spiteful today. And given her track record, she did. If he'd been incinerated, the suit would show more damage. But Constantine didn't have time to voice that, because the entirety of the Justice League, they thought they had just witnessed Bruce, Batman, the world's greatest detective, a founding member, their comrade, and at times leader, die. And suddenly, the fight got a lot more violent. Barry's speed left flames in the ground. John stopped holding back his powers. Diana's battle cry echoed like thunder as she slammed Cersei into the ground, with enough force to crater the earth. Clark's heat vision carved through incoming demons like a scalpel, his usual restraint for even the undead gone. His gaze locked onto Cersei with a frightening intensity the next moment. Hal's constructs morphed from defensive shields into razor-edged blades, slicing through magical barriers like they were paper. Even Constantine abandoned sarcasm for sheer, visceral spellwork, whispering Latin too fast for normal ears to follow, as arcane fire twisted from his fingers. Cersei barely had time to look afraid as she was surrounded, realizing one crucial miscalculation. She just made the Justice League angry. The fight was over within 15 minutes. Jean had had to personally fend off Diana from killing Cersei on the spot, while Clark rushed over to the empty suit. What was he going to tell Dick? To tell the rest of the kids? They all knew this was a part of the job. They had all risked death daily, and Bruce was no stranger to injury, no stranger to death. But to be incinerated? The cowl's empty lenses stared up at Clark from its deflated state. Constantine finally managed to shoulder his way through the chaos, kicking at the crumpled suit with his boot before crouching down. His fingers flicked out, a quick diagnostic spell shimmering over the fabric. "Relax, you lot," he muttered, ignoring how Clark's grip on the cape tightened protectively. "He's not dead." Diana whirled on him so fast her blade nearly took off Constantine's ear. "Explain." John exhaled sharply through his nose. "Why did no one in this bloody league understand basic magical theory?" Before jabbing a finger toward Cersei, currently restrained by glowing green lantern chains. "That was a transfiguration spell, not a disintegration one. She didn't kill him. She did her namesake's signature move. He glanced back up at their confused, worried stares, and rolled his eyes. Drummer queens, all of you. Constantine moved to shift through the pile of fabric. He's in here somewhere. Ah! Buried in the chestplate and underclothes, there was a creature, wide-eyed and flailing as Constantine picked it up by the feet. A bat. A giant, golden-crowned flying fox, to be specific, native to this region. There, see? He's alive, Constantine said with a smug smile. Leave magic to the experts, eh? The bat, Bruce, immediately let out an indignant screech, twisting in Constantine's grip, flapping his massive wings violently. His golden fur bristled, ears pinned back in clear fury at being manhandled like this. Clark's shoulders slumped with relief before he promptly dissolved into laughter, half relieved, half manic. Diana barely contained a snort behind her gauntlet while Hal wheezed, doubling over midair as his constructs flickered out from sheer amusement at Bruce's pitiful state, and the glee that came with knowing he wasn't dead. Constantine just sighed and dangled Bruce bat by one foot like an unruly cat. All right, you overgrown fruit bat. Settle down before I accidentally drop you. Bruce responded by sinking sharp little fangs into John's finger, with surprising accuracy for a creature that technically shouldn't know how to aim yet. Ow, you absolute wanker! Bruce, the bat, literal, had not been content to be examined by Constantine, who couldn't figure out a way to break the spell just yet, and neither could Zatanna. Both sorcerers had gone to question Circe instead, though, knowing her, it was a dead end. Her magic even beat Diana's lasso. To a degree, speaking in vague terms, that offered no help. Bruce had been handed off to Clark eventually, hooked feet and hands clinging onto his arm. The bat was practically vibrating on his arm. He's kind of scared, isn't he? Poor little guy, Barry mumbled as he approached Clark. Clark was trying his best to comfort the bat form of Bruce, gently stroking a finger over the small, fuzzy head as he nodded. Yeah, he must be terrified. Hal was hovering close by with a wide, teasing grin. Aw, look at the little bat. The big bad bat dude reduced to a little scaredy cat. Barry elbowed his side. Come on, that's not fair. He can't help being a cute bat. While they all fussed and fretted over Bruce, Diana stood aside, watching closely. What was worse was that Constantine confirmed Bruce didn't understand human language like this. So at the moment, he was confused, and smaller than normal, in a different body. It was funny. A little. But Clark and Diana had always been a bit protective over Bruce, and they didn't find it funny at all, especially when Hal reached out to try and touch the fruit bat, Bruce, who let out a high-pitched squeak in alarm. Clark's arm instinctively curled around Bruce Bat, shielding him from Hal's fingers with a glare that could melt steel. Back off, Jordan. His voice carried the kind of quiet warning usually reserved for world-ending threats. Diana was already stepping between them, her posture rigid. This isn't a joke, she snapped, gaze flickering to Bruce's twitching ears and the way his tiny claws gripped at Clark's sleeve like a lifeline. He doesn't understand what happened. Even John floated closer, his usual calm replaced by something sharper as he shot Hal a look. Hal threw up his hands in surrender. All right, I get it. No teasing the distressed bat. He wisely backed off, but not without muttering under his breath. Man, you guys are so dramatic over him. Barry sighed, waving at Bruce sympathetically before going to zoom off and continue scene cleanup. It is hard to read his mind, John admitted. Animals do not have complex language like we do. All I can sense is that he is experiencing fear, as well as brief images of his children. Bruce wanted his family. They hadn't broken the news to them yet. The mention made Clark's expression crumple a little. His mind was already conjuring up the horrified looks on their faces, the tears of shock and fear and confusion. How in the hell were they going to break this to them? What could they say? Hey, don't worry, B-Man is just a cute little bat now. He's still alive. No biggie. Jesus Christ, Dick was gonna freak. But Clark was the closest to the family, and the closest to Bruce. So he already knew it had to be him. Go, Diana urged. I will handle things here. We will find a way to reverse this. Her hand reached to rest on the large bat's back. Bruce didn't seem to mind her touch, though was too confused to do much else than grip Clark's arm tighter. Clark looked at the others, getting a resolute nod from John and a solemn one from Constantine. His expression softened as he looked down at Bruce Bat, gently scratching the soft golden fur between his ears. A low warble escaped the bat, but he leaned into the touch and seemed to relax a fraction. Clark nodded, his grip on Bruce Bat shifting protectively. I'll tell Alfred first. He'll know how to break it to the kids gently. And then he took off, gently, as to not stress the creature wrapped in red fabric. The flight back to Gotham was tense. Bruce clung tightly to Clark the entire way, occasionally letting out small, distressed chirps that made Clark's heart clench. By the time they touched down at Wayne Manor's doorstep, Alfred was already waiting, like he had somehow sensed something was wrong. Maybe through some kind of British butler ESP? One look at Clark's grim expression and the giant golden bat curled under his arm told him everything he needed to know before anyone even spoke. Ah, I see Master Bruce has taken his branding rather literally this time. Bruce had been shaking like a leaf by the time they had landed, buggy blue eyes, which he seemed to have retained despite the transformation, wide and alarmed, until he saw Alfred, and almost immediately scrabbled out of Clark's hold to try and make it over to the familiar, comforting face, only to fall flat onto the porch steps. The thing about bats? Not very good at the ground walking thing. And for Bruce, who had been the bat for all of an hour, he screeched, very high-pitched and chittering in the way fruit bats did, in distress as his claws found a lack of purchase on the smooth wood. The butler moved forward with haste. In one smooth motion, he scooped up the distressed bat Bruce with practiced hands, like Alfred Pennyworth knew how to properly handle a panicked, golden-crowned flying fox, probably from some obscure butler training manual. There now, Master Bruce, he murmured, cradling the trembling creature against his chest like it was second nature. His fingers worked gently through the fur at Bruce's nape, a soothing gesture that had worked since Bruce was 6 and terrified of thunderstorms, easily transferred to less humanoid forms. You're quite safe. Bruce immediately buried his face in Alfred's sleeve, tiny claws gripping the fabric like a lifeline as his panicked chitters slowly quieted into uneven little huffs. The effect was instant. This was Alfred. This was home. Clark let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, as Alfred shot him an utterly unimpressed look over the top of Bruce's fuzzy head, eyes sharp enough to flay skin off bone despite their calm demeanor. The silent message? Who did this? And where are their corpses? We're working on it, Clark's hesitant response came. Constantine and Zatanna aren't sure how to reverse the spell yet. Cersei did a transfiguration spell. She's being handled. And not gently. Bruce's heartbeat was rapid against Alfred, even for a bat. He, at least, was unharmed and alive. But being stripped of language, one's body, and assaulted with new senses and bodily functions, even the mighty Batman would be struggling with that. Alfred's expression darkened imperceptibly, his fingers never pausing in their methodical strokes along Bruce's fur. I see. His voice was deceptively mild, but Clark had known Alfred long enough to recognize the quiet storm brewing beneath. Bruce let out another small chirp against Alfred's chest, confused, vulnerable in a way Batman never allowed himself to be, and that seemed to stir something in the butler. His jaw tightened before he turned on his heel with military precision. Master Clark, Alfred said, crisply over his shoulder as he strode toward the manor doors. Bruce cradled securely like a disgraced emperor wrapped in silk. Do inform Miss Satana and Mr. Constantine that they have precisely 6 hours before I personally ensure the next visit to Gotham involves being sewn into sacks with rabid honey badgers. Clark swallowed hard and nodded mutely. He wasn't about to argue with that threat when it came to Alfred Pennyworth. Not when even gods feared the man's wrath when one of his children was suffering. And so Clark left, back to the watchtower to help with the interrogation, while Bruce stayed clung to Alfred, wet nose pressing into his pulse point as he stayed buried in the crook of his neck. The next part of the day would be difficult, alerting the family. And this constituted the emergency beacon, most certainly. Dick was the first one who responded to the alert. When he appeared through the Zeta tube and into the cave, still dressed in his Nightwing outfit and looking frazzled, like he'd just been dragged out of a mission, the last thing he'd been expecting was the sight of Alfred, cradling a giant bat on the Bat computer's main chair. His expression went slack with utter confusion before his brain finally seemed to catch up. "Alfred," he started slowly with wide eyes. "Is that a—" "I'd prefer to explain to the group at large," Alfred replied tightly. "Do take a seat, Master Dick." Soon, the rest of the family trickled in. The emergency beacon wasn't something played with lightly. It meant trouble. Which is why the increasing confusion surrounding Alfred holding a literal flying fox was surmounting. Tim seemed vaguely creeped out by the creature. Jason just eyed it, lost. Dick cooed a bit. Steph took pictures, until she was promptly shooed away by Alfred. Cass had figured it out upon first glance, and Damien? Well, the kid loved animals, and a golden-crowned flying fox was an incredible sight. Damien's face lit up the moment he laid eyes on the bat Bruce, currently ensconced in Alfred's arms. He immediately darted forward with an eagerness that rivaled an excited puppy, only to be stopped dead by a sternly raised hand from the butler. "Now, Master Damien," Alfred said, fixing Damien with a pointed look. "I must caution you to be gentle." Damien scowled. "Of course," he grumbled, but his eyes were already locked onto the bat with a mixture of awe and admiration. When he reached out to the bat, Bruce, not that anyone but Alfred and Cass had put that together yet, the creature didn't seem afraid, just immediately sniffed him before clambering to try and groom Damien. It was a very basic instinct. This is my child. Care for my child. And suddenly, the gesture, paired with the fact that Bruce was notably absent and had been on a mission related to magic only a small while ago, recognition flooded each of them. Dick let out a choked noise, something between laughter and horror, as his brain finally clicked. Wait, that's Bruce?" His voice cracked. Jason went stiff as a board, eyes darting from the bat, who was now meticulously nibbling at Damien's hair, to Alfred. "You're joking." Tim exhaled sharply through his nose and shoved his domino up to pinch at the bridge of it, like he was already getting a headache. "Great, just great." Beside him, Duke had lowered his phone from taking pictures. Steph's jaw dropped before she suddenly whipped around to point accusingly at Cass, who had been suspiciously quiet this whole time. "You knew? And you didn't warn us?" Cass shrugged slightly. "The blue eyes," she said like it was obvious. "Would be brown if it was a normal bat." Bruce was clinging to Damien's uniform and cleaning his face and hair with precision, one wing clumsily flapping and ending up covering the kid's face. Fruit bats of this species were the largest in the world. Bruce's current form was about a foot tall, with a 5-foot wingspan, larger than life, even as a literal bat. It was a scene that was so absurd that for a moment, nobody said anything. Everyone just stared in utter bewilderment as the world's greatest detective and current patriarch of a vigilante family, now a bat, ran his tongue along a strand of hair, while Damien was just sitting there, utterly still, and letting Bruce groom him like it was the most important thing in the world. His normal scowl was smoothed out, replaced by a look of pure fascination. Even Alfred looked like he was struggling to keep up his stoic demeanor at the sheer absurdity of it all. After a beat, he cleared his throat. "Yes, this," he gestured to the Bat Bruce, "is indeed Master Bruce." And the confirmation sent chaos erupting through the group. Their voices overlapped as they spoke at once. "How the hell did that happen?" Jason blurted before he lost it, doubling over with a bark of laughter so loud it echoed off the cave walls. "Oh my god, this is gold! The big bad bat reduced to a literal winged rat with no impulse control? More importantly, is it permanent?" Dick echoed his first statement, sounding twice as concerned and baffled. Tim pinched the bridge of his nose again. "Please don't tell me the only lead we have right now on how to fix this is John Constantine." Damien grinned as he adjusted Bruce's grip on his shoulder. "Father makes an excellent familiar." Steph had started taking closer-up photos of the manic grin. "So going in the group chat." Duke awkwardly glanced up at the cave bats. Is he, gonna hang out on the ceiling now?" Bruce seemed a bit overwhelmed with all of the noise. He flinched slightly as Jason's laughter got louder. With a sudden flap of his wings, he got off Damien, and was right back to latching onto Alfred, claws digging into his suit jacket as he landed chaotically and trembled. Alfred had had enough. They weren't taking this like the serious matter it was. "Everyone calm down." Alfred's booming command instantly cut through the chaos of noise and laughter. He shot a glare across the room, his sharp eyes sweeping the gathered group as he adjusted Bruce against his chest. Everyone went silent. "Do I have your attention?" "Good." Alfred's gaze softened a fraction as he looked down at Bruce, who was currently shaking like a leaf in his arms. "Master Bruce is currently in a highly vulnerable state. He is terrified and confused, and you lot are acting like children. Enough of this ridiculousness." The scolding was met with immediate sheepishness from Jason, Steph, Duke, and Damien. All that was left was the tension from Alfred's lingering tone, and Bruce's nervous chitters and breaths as he buried himself under a wing like a shield. It was only then that the grimness of the situation fully set in. Dick's hands curled into fists at his side. Bruce, his father, their mentor and leader, for God's sakes, was currently a literal bat. He was trembling and terrified, and all anyone had done in response to that was treat it like some hilarious situation to laugh and take pictures over. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to lose control over your mind, body, voice. He was the first to move, approaching with a gentle, quiet intent. "Alfred's right," he murmured, stepping closer with a hand outstretched toward Bruce Bat. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, letting the bat sniff him before attempting contact. "We need to be logical here." Jason sighed heavily through his nose before shoving his hands in his pockets with an awkward shuffle of feet. "Fine, but I reserve the right to mock him relentlessly after we fix this." Tim had already started typing furiously on a back computer keyboard. "We should put up all known cases of human-to-animal transfiguration magic and see what counterspells exist." Cass nodded once at Alfred in silent solidarity. She had been quietly furious since she realized Bruce was scared, rather than just confused, before moving beside Dick to help soothe their disoriented father figure by gently stroking along the soft fur between his wings. Even Damien looked contrite as he stepped forward again, much more carefully this time, with an offered piece of fruit from Alfred's always stocked snack tray nearby. "Father, apologies for my earlier behavior." Bruce had allowed the touches, didn't seem afraid of his children, but wasn't quite relaxing anymore now. He didn't even sniff the fruit, just staring with wide eyes and quick breaths. He didn't seem to want to move from Alfred at the moment. Steph had awkwardly lowered her phone. "I'll, go tell Babs and the birds of prey. We'll take over patrols," she offered in a weak apology to Alfred. Alfred nodded gratefully at Steph. Good. That would be much appreciated. Duke awkwardly cleared his throat. Maybe someone should tell Commissioner Gordon what's going on before he hears it from someone else. Just to, keep everyone in the loop. Dick's head snapped up. Right. Good thinking, Duke. Because that was the thing. Not only was this a horrible experience for Bruce, Gotham was now missing its true Batman. And it wasn't the same as it was with injuries or vacations, where they knew he'd be back. No. The uncertainty was harrowing. Tim's fingers flew over the keyboard. Guess we better pull out the contingency plans. He probably has one for something like this. Jason let out a slow breath through gritted teeth before muttering, Christ. Even he couldn't find humor anymore. Not when Gotham was on the line. Cass moved silently to Bruce Bat again, gently pressing her forehead against his tiny head. A wordless promise. We'll fix this. Dick straightened with forced calm. Okay, he said evenly, hands gripping the back of a chair so hard the metal groaned under his gloves. We'll handle this like we do everything else. Together. He pointed at Jason and Tim sharply. Research duty. Magical counterspells, previous cases like this. His gaze flicked to Steph and Duke next. Gotham needs its shadows, even if Batman can't be there right now. Finally, he turned towards Damien and Cass with firm resolve. And someone needs to make sure Dad doesn't accidentally fly into a ceiling fan. Alfred exhaled quietly in approval as Bruce finally relaxed against him again, though those wide eyes stayed darting between them all, like he knew something was wrong, but not what. The bat let out another quiet chirp before burying himself further into Alfred's jacket collar, as if trying to hide from reality itself. It was going to be a long night. Meanwhile, a golden lasso-wielding warrior sat cross-legged across from an infuriating sorceress in her cell. Diana leaned forward with razor-sharp sweetness. Now, Circe, let's try that spell reversal one more time. And that was the end of Chapter 1. Moving on, Chapter 2. After 6 hours, Alfred had received word. They still didn't know how to change Bruce back. Constantine and Zatanna were working tirelessly, but there were delays since they also had to deal with the post-battle mess of demons and sorcerers and other spell-affected heroes. The plan, at the moment, was just to take care of Bruce as is, which was more difficult than not. Bats were known for not thriving in captivity. Even Damien refused to keep one as a pet for morality alone. They weren't made to live indoors. With the lack of things to grab onto and the smooth surfaces, they were notoriously nervous. And especially in Bruce's particular case, sometimes stress could make them refuse to eat. Come on, Bee, just a bite, it's a banana, Tim was urging. Damien said you should love this. Damien had been going on a deep dive about bat rehabilitation and care, because as the resident animal obsessor, of course he was ensuring they were doing this correctly. Bruce was currently hanging in the kitchen, off of a post they'd made specifically for him. Upside down, he had his wings wrapped tightly around himself, and his eyes closed. He hadn't moved once since being put there. With his brain currently in nothing but animal instinct, he was shut down. Alfred set down a small dish of honey water. Damien's research indicated fruit bats sometimes preferred the extra sugar for energy in stressful situations, and let out the quietest sigh known to man. Master Tim, he murmured, stepping back with practiced patience. I fear pressuring him will only worsen matters. Dick hovered nearby like an anxious ghost, hands twitching at his sides as if physically restraining himself from intervening. We can't just leave him like this. His voice cracked slightly under the weight of what this even meant. Jason scoffed from where he was leaning against the counter, arms crossed tightly over his chest despite his casual tone. Yeah, no shit, but we also can't force-feed the traumatized bat who thinks he's supposed to be hanging in a cave somewhere instead of here. He gestured sharply at the manor's pristine kitchen, like it was some kind of insult to nature itself.
Tch! Acrodon dubatus do not dwell in caves. They prefer trees,
Damien muttered from where he was clicking away on his laptop for necessary supplies.
He's sad,
Cass whispered as she observed Bruce.
Not scared now. Sad.
She motioned to his ears. Rather than pinned back, they were just drooping. The realization settled like a weight in the room. Dick swallowed hard, staring at Bruce's small, miserable form. That pitiful body language was killing him. He's depressed. Tim said it before anyone else could, voice thick with something between disbelief and horror. Fuck. Jason looked ready to punch a hole in the wall, but settled for dragging his hands down his face instead. Oh, great. So now we've got an emotionally compromised bat. Fantastic. His sarcasm was razor thin over actual worry. Damien snapped his laptop shut, with more force than necessary, before standing abruptly. His expression steeled into something frighteningly determined, as he marched towards FruitBat, with single-minded focus.
We are remedying this immediately.
Cass didn't stop him when he carefully lifted Bruce off the post, and cradled him against his chest, just nodded, and followed Damien out of the kitchen without hesitation. Alfred arched a brow, but let them go. He trusted Damien knew what he was doing. Tim scrambled after them, nearly tripping over himself in confusion. Damie? Where are you going with our recently turned into a mammal dad? Damien didn't even glance back as he strode towards the grand staircase.
To remedy an error. Clearly father needs proper enrichment if we intend to house him temporarily like this.
Translation. They were raiding Wayne Manor's attic for things Bat Bruce could climb on. Bruce wasn't clinging onto Damien. Rather, he stayed in a stiff bundle, his wings wrapped tightly around himself and his eyes closed, like he was actively just trying to die. A likely possibility if they didn't get him comfortable. Damien's research had made the boy realize just how delicate bats were, let alone this particular species. This was mission critical. Bruce needed a proper enclosure. Damien's jaw set like he was about to personally fight the laws of nature itself.
Unacceptable.
He adjusted his grip carefully, cradling Bruce back closer.
You will not surrender to this.
His voice was low, firm, not just for Bruce, but for himself. Then he turned sharply towards Dick with a glare that hid his anxiety.
Grayson, we require proper climbing structures in a humidity-controlled environment immediately if we are to further prevent distress or health complications. I have already forwarded you the specifications via text.
Dick didn't even hesitate, just nodded and tapped his communicator with military precision as he strode off toward the Batcave armory. On it. We can modify those collapsible training bars into perches. Jason rolled up his sleeves. All right, who's waiting Wayne Enterprises R&D lab for portable heat lamps? Tim started speed reading Damien's compiled research on his phone. Oh my god, bats can get hypothermia from stress? Cass wordlessly began to pick out items that would work for perches as they reached the attic. Some plant trellises that they often used for the exterior walls, some extra blankets, fake plants to create a visual barrier and stimulate nature. They couldn't put him outside, not in the middle of fall in Gotham. Alfred, meanwhile, prepped a room, one of the sunrooms that had the most view of the outdoors and the most amount of natural lighting. Within 2 hours, the group was building a mini, fully functioning bat sanctuary. The room had become an odd kind of domestic group activity. Damien was currently standing on a stepladder as he strung up the modified training bars, while Tim hung the heat lamps around the room with calculated precision. Jason was in the corner, wrestling a pile of fake plants into various shapes that would offer as much cover as possible, plus provide visual stimulation. Dick was darting around in bat-proofing. Steph was fiddling with an air purifier they bought from the nearest home improvement store. Cass hovered nearby, holding Bruce, now wrapped in a blanket to keep him warm while the heat was still rising in the room. Alfred kept a watchful eye over them like a hawk while he set the humidifiers to precise outputs. Jason was the first to step back, surveying the fruits of their labor with a slight grimace as he wiped sweat off his forehead. "Think it'll do?" Damien carefully hung the last perch, a parrot rope he'd ordered on delivery. He'd ordered a lot from the pet store.
"We'll need to monitor the temperature."
Dick adjusted the lighting carefully, testing each setting with a small click of the remote. "There, daylight adjacent. I have it set to dim and brighten with the sun." The floor-to-ceiling window wall in the back was already displaying distant Gotham in all its grimy glory. It was perfect. But there was still one problem. Bruce was still refusing to come out of his bat burrito of depression. The room was nearing optimal temperature when Jason let out a frustrated sigh. "Okay, we have heat, fake foliage for cover, and a shit ton of climbing spots. What are we still missing?" Tim took a measured breath, trying desperately to suppress the anxiety rising in his chest. This was Bruce. The man was never sensitive. "Maybe the humidity is off?" Dick shook his head and rubbed his forehead stressfully. "No, me and Alf triple-checked. It's perfect." Cass tilted her head as she observed Bruce in her arms.
"Low sugar?"
she guessed, handing him carefully to Alfred.
"He has not eaten or drank,"
she added. Alfred took Bruce with practiced ease before stepping up to a table that had been prepared for this moment. There was chopped fruit and honey water available. He stated he was going to force-feed Batman a snack if he had to, and it looked like that was the game plan. Damien wordlessly came over, preparing a small, needleless syringe and filling it with the sugar water before handing it to Alfred. Alfred took the syringe with a silent nod, carefully adjusting Bruce in his grip to allow for access. The man-turned-bat still had his eyes closed in the bundle. He was breathing slow and uneven, an animal sick with stress and too disoriented to realize that he had the proper environment to thrive now. "Come now, Master Bruce," he murmured, voice steady. "This is hardly the most undignified position I've seen you in." A pause. "Though it may be the fuzziest." Alfred gently pressed the syringe near Bruce's mouth, allowing droplets of sugar water to roll against his muzzle. Jason hovered nearby like an especially tense shadow. Tim had abandoned all pretense of not hovering entirely, and was practically vibrating beside Dick's shoulder. Damien moved to help gently pry Bruce's mouth open, just enough for Alfred to let a few drops under his gums. And after a moment, Bruce's tongue, a long, thin thing in his bat body, darted out, twice. And then he was accepting the sugar water properly, drinking from the syringe as those familiarly colored but differently shaped eyes opened slowly. The entire room seemed to exhale at once, Jason's shoulders slumping in relief while Tim let out a choked laugh that sounded suspiciously like he was holding back tears. Dick didn't even bother hiding his grin as he clapped a hand on Damien's shoulder. "Nice job, Damie." Only for Damien to shrug him off with a grumble.
"Tch, I was merely applying common knowledge with feeding sick fosters."
After about 10 minutes, Bruce had drank 3 syringes of sugar water and was looking a lot more alert. His ears pointed up as he gazed about the room, wings shifting restlessly in the bundle of blankets. The environment was suitable, warm, humid, and natural-looking enough. "We're getting there," Tim murmured, watching Bruce with a critical eye. "He seems more aware, at least." Damien nodded and crossed his arms, surveying the room with a sharp gaze.
"His distress levels have decreased. The humidity and temperature are ideal, but we still need one more thing to keep his stress from increasing again. Enrichment."
Jason raised an eyebrow.
"Enrichment? Like toys or something?"
"Yes, I have some toys we will dangle from the posts."
He tugged Jason into helping him. Alfred had carefully unwrapped Bruce, who clambered out of his grip, resting instead on his shoulder and moving side to side, like he was struggling to figure out a way onto the wired ceiling to climb around. Cass was the first to act, gracefully stepping up with one of the modified training bars they'd rigged from the attic. She held it steady near Alfred's shoulder, close enough for Bruce to reach if he chose. Dick's grin returned full force as he whispered, "Watch this," just as Bruce's tiny claws flexed once, twice, before latching onto the bar with cautious curiosity. His wings stretched slightly, testing weight and balance before he began creeping along the length of it in slow, deliberate motions. Jason snorted.
Yeah, okay, that's adorable.
Tim was already pulling out his phone to take photos. Damien watched with narrowed eyes for exactly 5 seconds before declaring,
"We require more climbing structures immediately."
Then he spun on his heel towards Dick and Jason, like a general marshalling troops.
"You two, help me modify additional perches."
Alfred merely adjusted his cuffs and observed Bruce Bat's tentative exploration with quiet satisfaction before murmuring, "I shall prepare a bowl of figs in case further sustenance is required." The mission was far from over, but progress had been made. Day 2. Bruce climbed slowly along the training post. His clawed feet were sensitive. He could feel each grain in the wood. Click, grasp, click, grasp. It was soothing, moving around like this, slow and steady. The vines surrounding him were a comforting, well, he couldn't tell colors well. Everything was different shades than he was used to, but it was still nice. His eyes flipped to the forms on the ground, his pups, curled in sleeping bags. He wanted to get to them, but the ground was danger. He wasn't sure why they were down there. He wanted them up high, under his wings, safe. But they were resting. He wouldn't wake them, even if it was odd that they were sleeping while he felt so awake. The moonlight seeping through the windows slowly began to turn pink with the rising sun. The family had opted to sleep in Bruce's enclosure tonight, minus Alfred, whose back couldn't quite handle that. It wasn't that they didn't trust Bruce could be alone, but the bat seemed more comfortable watching them. Click, click, click. Bruce's steady climbing around the enclosure was a background noise, accompanied by the humidifier's low hum. Dick stirred first, blinking groggily against the early dawn light filtering through the windows. His eyes immediately darted upward, tracking Bruce's slow, methodical movements along the climbing structures with a sleepy smile. "Morning, me," he murmured, voice rough from sleep as he stretched his arms over his head. "You're looking way more active today." Jason cracked one eye open from where he was sprawled half out on his sleeping bag like a disgruntled cat.
Ugh, what time is it?
He stretched, before freezing when he spotted Bruce paused mid-climb, wings slightly spread as if considering descending toward them. Tim, who had somehow ended up cocooned in 3 blankets like a suburban burrito, peered blearily at the scene and mumbled into his pillow. "He keeps looking at us like we're supposed to be hanging from the ceiling, too." Damien sat bolt upright instantly.
"It is natural for him to want us elevated."
He squinted critically at their makeshift camp setup before declaring,
"We should ring hammocks next time."
It was like Bruce, despite being unable to understand Damien, shared the sentiment. He watched them closer, because one moment he was bobbing side to side, like he was aiming the distance. Then he leaped, and landed straight onto Tim's face, grasping into his hair and shoulders. Tim let out a startled "oomph" as 3 pounds of fur blinded him momentarily. Bruce's claws tangled securely in his hair, wings fluttering to get comfortable before settling with his body, perched on Tim's shoulder and side of his head. One wing was draped like a living, breathing cowl over his forehead. Jason wheezed, before slapping a hand over his mouth to muffle the laughter shaking his shoulders.
Oh my god, he's nesting. Ain't bats do that in people's hair?
Dick scrambled onto his knees, phone already out and recording, despite the fact that Tim was currently being smothered by their father-turned-oversized bat.
"This is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me."
Damien watched with something disturbingly close to approval.
"Father recognizes us,"
he noted solemnly as Bruce snuzzled deeper into Tim's disheveled bangs, before letting out a soft chittering noise that could only be described as content.
He has claimed Drake first, because he is visibly the weakest.
Tim, still half draped in blankets, and now sporting an additional bat hat, flipped Damien off with one shaky hand while whispering, "Help me." But it was too late. Cass giggled just softly as she nudged Duke awake. Just in time to witness Bruce start to groom Tim's hair, nudging into his scalp and leaving more drool than actually cleaning him. At least he was trying? Duke, who had been blissfully unaware of the chaos until now, took one bleary look at Tim, hair a disaster, tiny bat paws kneading into his scalp, like he was trying to give the world's weirdest massage, and immediately burst into laughter so hard he choked on his own spit. Jason wiped tears from his eyes while Dick wheezed out, "This is better than I could have ever dreamed." Still recording with zero shame, Cass nodded approvingly as Bruce continued his very earnest, if messy, grooming efforts. Damien pulled out a notepad and started scribbling observations like this was some kind of critical behavioral study.
Fascinating. He has chosen pack bonding through tactile care.
Tim, meanwhile, sat frozen in resigned horror as Bruce chittered proudly and licked a particularly stubborn cowlick down flat, with all the dedication of Alfred polishing silverware. "Guys," his voice cracked slightly, "I think I'm being taste tested." Bruce stopped grooming after a moment. He made his way to the ground, laid out with rugs easy for bat claws to grasp onto, and sort of awkwardly hobbled his way over to Dick next. Dick instantly lowered his phone to give Bruce his full attention, grinning fondly as he sat down in a way that wouldn't seem too eager. He held out his hand, a calm, stable invitation, and whispered a soft, "Hey, Bee, good morning," as Bruce Bat stumbled toward him on unsteady legs. Their father-turned creature didn't hesitate to clamber onto Dick's lap, and use his claws to climb up his outer arm. Just like he did with Tim and Damien the other day, he dutifully started grooming. His wing ended up wrapped entirely around Dick's face, the outlines of his features showing through the thin, leathery membrane. Jason collapsed back onto the floor in a fit of silent laughter, shoulders shaking as he tried, and failed, to muffle himself with both hands. Dick, now effectively wearing Bruce as a bat blindfold, could only raise his arms in surrender, voice muffled but still delighted. "Oh my God, I'm being loved, aggressively." Damien watched the scene like it was a scientific breakthrough.
"He is pack bonding with you,"
he noted with far too much gravitas for this ridiculous situation.
"You should be honored."
Tim, finally free and still damp from earlier Bruce spit, collapsed backward into his blankets while muttering darkly about favoritism. Cass nudged him sympathetically. Duke leaned back on his hands. "So, not to bring down the vibes, but any news yet on if they figured out how to turn him back?" The question hung in the air like a cold breeze. The room collectively sobered, laughter dying down as reality settled back in. Dick carefully reached up to gently adjust Bruce's wings enough so that he could breathe, and also see. His grin was still there, but softer now, tinged with something bittersweet. "Constantine's working on it. Zatanna, too." Jason crossed his arms, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers, while muttering, "Magic users take forever." Damien hesitated before stepping closer to where Bruce was still clinging onto Dick, like an overzealous scarf, and holding out a fig from Alfred's carefully stocked cart.
"Until then," he said stiffly, "we maintain the mission."
Bruce had taken the fruit in his jaws, sharp teeth mashing the fruit a bit messily. Dick ended up with bits on his shirt. Duke nodded slowly. "It's just like," he sighed, before shrugging. "How old do you think he is, in this form?" That was something everyone had already considered, because Bruce had been an adult as a human, and an adult as a bat. This particular species lived about 30 years. Bruce had been in his late 40s, a bit over half of his expected lifespan as a human, so theoretically, Bruce as a bat would be the equivalent of a 17-year-old bat, meaning he'd live maybe another 13 years as a bat, if left in this form indefinitely, much shorter than the decades ahead of him as a human. The knowledge felt heavy. Dick seemed to deflate, shifting his grip so Bruce could cling to his chest instead.
Well, worst case scenario.
He took a steadying breath, hands shaking very slightly as he ran them through the soft fur on the bat's back.
He only has a decade left. But hey, maybe that's more than he would as a person with our lives.
Cass hugged her knees loosely as she watched Damien offer out another piece of fruit, a strawberry this time.
He would not be Dad, she whispered. Not how he really is.
Dick swallowed hard, suddenly looking very tired as the weight of that truth hit him. Bruce, in this form, wasn't just a temporary inconvenience. If they didn't fix this, he wasn't Bruce. Not the man who had trained them, not the mentor who had pulled Jason out of Crime Alley, who had taught Damien how to control his anger instead of letting it control him, not the father who let Dick lean on him when things got too heavy, or taught Tim to expect more than the bare minimum, not the soul who had taken in Cass at her most broken point, or balanced Duke's hyper-independence with teamwork. He'd be just a Pat. Jason stood abruptly, too sharp, too sudden. He strode towards where his helmet was resting on a side table, like he needed something to do with his hands before they shook apart completely.
Then we don't fail,
he bit out, low and raw, but certain all at once.
We get him back.
Damien nodded once, sharply, but didn't look away from feeding Bruce another piece of fruit. Tim exhaled shakily and reached for his laptop again, like answers was just another keystroke away. Cass studied them all before shifting to cuddle up next to Dick. Duke sighed, rolling his shoulders.
At least he's kind of fun like this,
he murmured, and then his eyes lit up.
You guys want to see if he can fly?
The shift in the room was palpable. Dick, who had been seconds away from spiraling into existential terror over their father's possible fate, now looked up at Duke with an expression caught between horrified and intrigued. Jason, putting his boots on, slowly turned on his heel.
I hate that you just said that out loud,
he announced.
But also, we absolutely have to see.
Tim groaned while rubbing at his temples, though there was no denying the reluctant curiosity sparking behind it. Cass nodded very quickly, then pointed toward the center manor, the high ceilings of the grand hall.
We will require proper safety protocols. We do not want him to become stuck somewhere, or injure himself,
Damien said firmly. Still, it seemed like a good idea, especially as Bruce fluttered and flopped bodily on the ground. Not a high enough vantage from here or his enclosure ceiling to properly get a good flight in. Dick was the first to carefully cross the room where Bruce had landed. He was already calculating every single aspect of how this could go wrong.
Okay,
he said, holding down the rising panic in his voice.
We have a tall ceiling and a giant, stressed-out bat who is very attached to all of us. What could possibly go wrong?
Jason rolled his eyes and stepped next to Dick with his arms crossed.
Quit being a baby, dickhead. We'll just let him fly a few circles around the room. No big deal.
Gathering Bruce, the group headed out of the room. They approached the grand staircase and climbed up to the banister. Bruce already seemed interested. His blue eyes darted around the space, shifting from clinging to Dick's arm to hanging upside down off of his sleeve. Dick hesitated, gripping the banister tightly as he glanced down at Bruce, who was now swaying slightly in the air currents of the manor's grand hall. Jason smirked beside him, already nudging forward.
Come on, golden boy. Don't chicken out now.
Tim had his arms crossed, but leaned in with undeniable curiosity. This is either going to be really cool or really bad. Damien adjusted his stance, ready to leap if needed, but still nodded once in approval. Cass watched silently from below, hands twitching like she was already planning how to catch Bruce midair if things went south. Duke just grinned, quickly running halfway down the stairs for a better vantage point to take a video. Bruce swung side to side a little, calculating, before suddenly he launched himself off of Dick. For a heart-stopping moment, he plummeted. But then, whoosh! His wings caught the air properly, and he started doing circles around the chandelier. Oh, shit! Dick nearly toppled over the railing in pure exhilaration, watching Bruce soar with all the grace of a creature born to rule the night sky. Jason let out a wild laugh, while Tim clutched his own hair, like he was resisting the urge to scream. That was so cool, he wheezed. Damien, ever composed, nodded once, but even he couldn't hide how his eyes tracked Bruce's every movement with awe. Cass grinned before scrambling onto a nearby table for an even better view as Bruce banked sharply around another lap of the hall. And Duke? Duke was grinning like an idiot as he held up his phone, shouting, "He's like a bat drone!" It lasted about 5 minutes. Bruce had clearly needed to get the energy out. The man, as a human, was constantly moving. As a bat, he'd apparently been craving it too. They'd expected him to fly back to one of them once he was done. He'd been clinging up to this point after all. But instead, a problem arose when Bruce promptly beelined to the chandelier and landed on it instead. It was like some form of karmic justice. All the kids had their stints on the chandelier. It was Bruce's turn. Dick immediately pressed both hands to his face and howled with laughter. Jason wheezed so hard he nearly collapsed against the railing, shaking in disbelief while muttering, "Oh my God, of course he did, Dick. This is your fucking fault." Tim was already calculating which chandelier chain looked safest to climb, without breaking it entirely, and or pissing Alfred off beyond repair. Damien just crossed his arms and muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, "Typical." Duke zoomed in on the recording.
Shit. Escape artist.
Cass tilted her head as she studied Bruce, now comfortably hanging from one of the dangling crystal ornaments.
Like father, like children.
It was pretty funny. At least until Bruce, with the self-preservation of any animal, started chewing on the wiring a bit. The laughter died in an instant, as they all stared up at Bruce with identical wide-eyed expressions, like he'd turned himself into a ticking time bomb. Jason was the first to speak.
He's not seriously trying to chew through a chandelier cord, right?
Dick had one hand over his chest now, the other pressed to his mouth like he was about to pass out.
Bruce, don't chew the vintage wiring, bee.
Tim was already scrambling for the edge of the banister, but Damien beat him to it, leaping onto the chandelier with the grace of someone taught to do so by the very first Robin who'd started the trend. Bruce, meanwhile, was just obliviously munching. He didn't seem particularly bothered by Damien sliding closer. Damien approached the situation like he was tracking prey, precise and methodical. He didn't make any sudden movements, nor any loud noises, and he tried very hard to look like he wasn't focused on his target as he edged closer and closer to Bruce Bat. When he'd landed just a few feet away, he cleared his throat and ordered, "Father, you are not permitted to chew on my ancestors' chandelier wires," and promptly scooped the Batman into his arms. Bruce didn't protest, just licked his lips and smacked his chops a couple times, like Insulator had been a particularly enjoyable treat. His claws hooked into Damien's clothes securely.
He's kinda got no brain cells, huh?
Duke mused.
Maybe it's a nice break from his usual 1,200-mile-per-hour mind.
Jason barked out a startled laugh while scrubbing a hand down his face.
I mean, if anyone deserves to have zero thoughts for once.
Dick was still gripping the banister like it was the only thing keeping him upright, wheezing out,
"It's absolutely him. Oh my God."
Tim reached over, without looking, and patted Damien's shoulder, who had landed back on the ground beside him.
"He really is just vibing."
Cass hummed.
"No thoughts, just that."
She grinned at Duke.
"Vacation."
Bruce was shifting in Damien's arms, clearly ready to fly more. The hall was a big space, but he hadn't been able to do more than circles. Damien sighed. He knew that look well. He'd seen it in his own eyes in the mirror. That restless itch to move, to act, to explore. He'd gotten it from Bruce, after all. It seemed that behavior repeated even in bat form. The room had been fun, but there was no substitute for the open air. The others looked over as Damien grumbled,
"Yes, yes,"
and shifted his grip to better support Bruce with one arm as he started moving downstairs.
We'll take you outside.
It was early fall, so while the weather wasn't overly cold, there were dangers. What happened if Bruce got by a hawk? A dog? What if he flew away and they couldn't find him? Of course, he already had a tracker, courtesy of Alfred, but still. Dick immediately moved to intercept, hands in a wait gesture.
Okay, hold on. Outside is vastly different from inside the manor. There's wind, birds of prey, random Gotham citizens who might freak out seeing a bat the size of a small dog just flying around.
Jason folded his arms and tilted his head toward Damien with an approving smirk. But also, imagine how funny it would be if some rich asshole walking through Bristol finally got dive-bombed by Dad. Tim groaned while pulling up Bruce's tracker status on his phone.
Alfred already tagged him like he was an endangered species at risk for poaching. We can find him even if he does get spooked. Geez, what if someone thinks he's a vampire and shoots him? That already happens while he's human.
Duke muttered. But Damien ignored the concerns. Because Bruce was wiggling and chirping restlessly, and their father, even in bat form, needed his enrichment. He couldn't exactly go out and fight crime, after all. With the stubbornness only a Wayne could muster, Damien tightened his grip on Bruce Bat and strode toward the back doors leading to the manor gardens.
If any human or animal attempts to harm Father,
he declared, eyes narrowed in warning,
they will answer to me.
Dick scrambled after him, half concerned Big Brother mode, half dying to see this. Jason was already pulling out his phone to live stream. Cass walked ahead and threw open the doors like she was ushering in destiny itself, while Tim opened up the tracker's screen. And Duke? Duke just grinned as he aimed his camera at Damien's retreating back and whispered,
"This is either going to be adorable or catastrophic."
They got outside, and Damien hiked them up to a hill on the north side of the manor grounds, tall enough for Bruce to comfortably take off.
Okay, maybe we can just hold him and let him look at the sun? I mean...
Dick fretted. But it was too late. Damien held Bruce up from where he was clinging to his hands, and Bruce launched. He began to fly, 50, 100, 200 feet. He evened out at 300, out of reach, but within view, soaring a little past the manor property before circling back and going the other way. Dick made a noise somewhere between hysterical laughter and terror as he watched Bruce's familiar pattern in the sky.
Oh my God, he's still doing a patrol route.
Jason grinned.
Old habits die hard, huh?
Tim groaned at the screen.
He's literally following Gotham airspace regulations for altitude and perimeter. How?
Still Batman,
Cass whispered with absolute reverence as she tilted her head back to watch Bruce Bat bank sharply around the next turn. Precise, efficient, like it was muscle memory, even now, to move with intent. Damien crossed his arms with a proud smirk that said, "I told you so." Duke just zoomed in on his phone recording and whispered,
"Bat signal's got nothing on this."
It was about 10 minutes after Bruce had been flying around that Alfred came outside carrying breakfast picnic baskets. The butler raised his eyebrows, taking in the sight of his entire family gathered on the hill while staring up at the sky with expressions ranging from excitement to terror. And then he looked up and made a soft noise of surprise at the sight of Bruce Bat circling overhead. Dick whipped around and beamed at the butler, still half laughing in stunned disbelief.
"He's flying. Yes, Master Richard, I can see that."
Alfred wordlessly began to pass out food items, though he was watching Bruce from the corner of his eye uncertainly. He'd been feeling very protective of his first charge. Rarely was the man ever this vulnerable. Dick accepted his plate, but barely touched the food, too busy staring up at the sky like Bruce might disappear into the clouds if he blinked.
"I think he's having fun,"
he murmured, voice soft with something between awe and worry. Jason took his sandwich without looking, eyes still tracking Bruce's movements before muttering,
"Of course he is. No responsibilities, no rogues breathing down his neck. Just flying around like a giant fruit bat on vacation."
He paused before adding dryly,
"Lucky bastard."
Tim kept one hand on the tracker while reaching blindly for tea with the other. Cass took her portion silently, but didn't eat yet, instead opting to pat Alfred's arm in reassurance before glancing back up. And Damien? Damien stood there rigidly as Alfred handed him a plate of fruit for Bruce, still scanning the skies for any potential threats, like an overprotective centennial. But even he couldn't hide how his shoulders relaxed slightly when Bruce executed a perfect mid-air turn. Alfred watched them all with quiet warmth, before clearing his throat softly and offering one final observation.
I suppose Master Bruce has earned this small reprieve.
The group settled in then, watching their father/mentor/charge soar freely above them, while snacking in comfortable silence. It wasn't every day that they got to see Batman this unburdened. The stress of the situation was still high, but the family always sought positives, subconsciously or not. This was a nice reprieve. Eventually, Bruce seemed to tire after about 45 minutes, circling them a few times to get lower, before he was landing a bit chaotically into Alfred's chest. Panting a bit, the man-turned-bat seemed very satisfied, dangling from his wing claws off Alfred's suit jacket. Alfred didn't even flinch, just adjusted his grip carefully to support his body, like he'd been expecting it.
Quite the aerial performance, Master Bruce,
he murmured dryly, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward as Bruce Bat let out a contented chirp and promptly went boneless against him. Jason snorted into his sandwich.
Oh, now he decides to be clingy again.
Dick reached over to gently scratch behind Bruce's ears, earning a sleepy blurp in response. Grinning when Alfred didn't protest, just held their exhausted vigilante turned flying fox with all the dignity of a man who had long since accepted that his life was anything but normal. Tim finally lowered the tracker, exhaling in relief now that Bruce was safely grounded again.
We should probably get him inside before he decides nap time is over and goes for round 2.
It was about 8 in the morning at that point, and Bruce looked half asleep against Alfred as they returned to the enclosure. The family followed in a loose procession, some still grinning, Jason, Duke, some stifling yawns, Tim, others just quietly basking in the warmth of the moment, Cass, Dick, Damien. Dick held the door open as Alfred carried their drowsy Bat-Dad inside, where the modified enclosure waited like a luxury penthouse suite for tiny-winged billionaires. Bruce barely stirred when they tucked him into his little hanging cocoon of blankets, just let out another sleepy murp noise before curling tighter into himself, wings draped over his face like an organic sleep mask, feet hooked securely on the post. Damien gave one last suspicious glare to the nearest window, just in case any rogue pigeons got ideas, before stepping back with a nod of approval.
Acceptable.
Alfred smoothed out invisible wrinkles on his sleeves and sighed deeply, the sigh of a man who had raised far too many dramatic vigilantes to be surprised by anything anymore.
I shall prepare breakfast for those who haven't eaten,
he announced, already turning toward the kitchen with practiced ease.
And perhaps some fresh fruit for our resident chiropteran.
Duke collapsed onto a nearby couch, scrolling through his videos.
Best morning ever,
he declared to no one in particular. And as sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating Bruce's perfectly sleeping form, swaying gently in his enclosure, his family milling around him with soft voices and softer smiles, it was hard to argue otherwise. And that is the end of Chapter 2. On to Chapter 3. Day 3. Warm. It was warm. The fruit tasted good. It was the yellow one, the mushy one. Bruce forgot what it was called, but he appreciated Alfred feeding it to him nonetheless. His pups were smiling. That was good. He liked it when they were content. Though why they were awake during the daytime was beyond him. Still, he didn't mind being interrupted from sleep for a snack. Bruce lazily munched another piece of banana from where Alfred was dutifully feeding him. It was about 5 in the evening. The hammocks had gone well last night. Bruce had moved between the kids in rotation, and while he was a bit active and kept waking them up occasionally, they didn't mind when it meant bat snuggles.
Constantine said he'll be here in a minute,
Dick mentioned as he looked up from his hammock.
Apparently he has news.
Whether that was good or bad, he hadn't said. Duke looked up from his phone at that, one eyebrow raised.
So he's actually communicating now? Finally came out of whatever hole in the ground he's been hiding in this whole time?
Jason leaned forward, already bracing for what news Constantine had to share.
About how to change him back?
Alfred sighed and continued feeding Bruce Bat from the little pouch.
We shall see, Master Jason.
Dick sat up, running a hand through his hair, and that familiar nervous tick. Tim didn't seem quite as convinced.
He better have good news, or I'm making him clean up Bruce's bat poop in the enclosure.
He grumbled, only half joking. Bruce licked his muzzle clean before closing his eyes groggily, sleepily, especially when Cass started petting his back and neck. Damien looked mildly disappointed about Bruce turning back so soon, but didn't voice it as he put clean water in the humidifier.
Hopefully we get him back, huh?
Duke murmured, but just as he spoke, poof, Constantine appeared in a puff of smoke in the room. The family had gotten used to Constantine popping into existence, except Bruce, who could be quite nervous as a bat and squealed in pure horror for a second. Dick immediately started soothing Bruce Bat with soft murmurs and head scratches, trying to keep him calm even when Constantine stretched out with a groan. The man looked exhausted. He had bags under his eyes, his coat was disheveled like he'd been tossing and turning, and even though his hands were tucked in his pockets, they still shook slightly.
Fuck. Made him a bloody mansion in the mansion, did ya?
He muttered, glancing around with an impressed expression. Bruce had clambered onto Dick, where he clung a bit, Alfred draping a blanket over him to hide. Dick curled around Bruce protectively, still rubbing gentle circles between his wings as he shot Constantine a look.
We take care of our own, John,
he said pointedly. Jason folded his arms and tilted his head with a dry smirk.
Yeah, unlike some people who just poof out for days without updates.
Tim, ever the pragmatist, just tapped the screen of his tablet impatiently.
So, what's the verdict?
Constantine grumbled, but dragged a hand down his face.
Zat's out getting the necessary ingredients. Damn dramatic sorceress Circe is. It took a while to get an answer.
His knuckles were bruised and cracked. John wasn't known for his gentle tactics.
So, good news? Got the recipe for the reversal potion.
A collective exhale of relief swept through the room. Tim sagged against the couch. Jason stopped glaring long enough to glance at Bruce, with something softer in his expression, and even Damien's rigid posture loosened slightly. Dick grinned as he adjusted his grip on their still startled Bat Dad.
That's fantastic. So, how soon can we...
Constantine held up a finger.
Bad news? It's going to be a bit of a pain in the arse.
He dug into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled list scrawled in what looked like blood.
We need ingredients that don't exactly grow on Earth proper, so got a few out on a space mission.
He shrugged, tilting onto his heels and motioning towards the bundle Dick was holding.
Your daddy-o will be a bat for another few days or so.
There was a beat of silence while the family absorbed that news. The idea of waiting another few days where literally anything could happen, was far from appealing. They'd all grown attached to their new furry family member, but they also wanted Bruce back. But Constantine had clearly taken time and effort to figure this situation out, and they could hardly say they were ungrateful when they were finally at the precipice of a solution. Constantine shrugged.
Good news, though. You got something.
He snapped his fingers, and at his feet appeared the Batman suit, cleaned and folded nicely.
Done examining it.
Damien's face brightened as he approached the suit, almost reverent in how gently he grabbed the cape and ran his fingers across the bat symbol on the chest. Tim was already reaching for the mask, inspecting the visor and lenses with sharp eyes. Dick was still holding Bruce, but he peered around the wings with an expression of cautious hope. Alfred hummed in light approval.
You laundered Master Bruce's suit.
Constantine made a face like he'd just bitten into something sour.
What? No. Zatanna did.
He shuddered at the thought of actually doing domestic labor before shaking his head and turning to leave. Jason squinted down at the utility belt, then up at Constantine's retreating back.
Wait, why did you have to examine B-Man's suit in the first place?
Constantine didn't answer, just waved dismissively over his shoulder as he vanished again with another poof, leaving behind only a faint smell of cigarette smoke and brimstone, as well as what looked like a basket of tropical fruits.
Duke snorted. Did he leave Bruce a snack package?
Bruce seemed to have relaxed once Constantine was gone, his wet nose poking out from under the blanket to sniff the air. Jason picked up one of the fruits, inspecting it with mild suspicion before shrugging and tossing it towards Damien, who caught it with one hand like the overachieving little assassin he was.
Guess even Constantine isn't heartless enough to leave without at least some kind of peace offering,
Duke mused, reaching for what looked like a mangosteen. FruitBat finally peeked out from his blanket cocoon, nose twitching as he zeroed in on the fruit pile with sudden intensity. Dick laughed, adjusting his grip as Bruce started wiggling excitedly.
Oh? Someone's feeling better now that the scary wizard is gone, huh?
He reached for a soursop and broke it open before offering it to Bruce, who immediately snatched it up in tiny claws and started nibbling happily. Alfred watched them all with quiet amusement before clearing his throat softly.
I believe I shall prepare dinner while Master Bruce enjoys his impromptu tropical feast.
He gave a pointed look at Tim, who had already stolen 3 lychees.
And do try not to spoil your appetite.
The room settled into warmth again, Constantine's visit leaving behind more reassurance than tension this time, despite the lingering mysteries. Bruce munched away on exotic fruits in Dick's lap, while Jason and Damien bickered over who got the last rambutan. Cass promptly stole it instead. They were getting Bruce back. Day 4. The pups were making happy noises at him. He wasn't sure why. The smallest one was holding him, and the biggest one was putting something on his head. It covered his face a bit uncomfortably, but he didn't mind. His pups were happy, so that was nice. He watched as they put the black rectangle thing in front of him again. His tongue darted out to absently lick his muzzle, which they made more noises about. Huh. What was going on?
Oh my god, look at him.
Duke laughed.
He looks so fucking confused.
They'd gotten Bat Bruce a cowl, a little mini Batman cowl, bundled in Damien's arm in a small bit of black fabric meant to resemble his cape. He looked a little ridiculous. Dick was practically howling with laughter, doubled over as Bruce Bat blinked sluggishly in his tiny cowl, looking every bit the disgruntled Dark Knight, just smaller and furrier.
This is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Jason wiped an actual tear from his eye while snapping pictures like a proud soccer mom.
I'm making this my lock screen. No, my wallpaper. Alfred's getting a framed copy for Father's Day.
Tim, normally the voice of reason, was too busy wheezing into his hands to protest any of it, while Cass silently handed Damien a miniature batarang. Where did she even get that? Just to complete the aesthetic. It was then that Alfred walked in, to a very confused but not upset looking Bat Bruce, in what was basically a Batman Halloween costume for dogs. He let out a couple of clicks and chirps at the butler, as if saying,
Please save me. The children are being strange again.
The butler didn't bat an eye at the sight, like he'd seen far crazier things on many, many occasions. He simply set down a tray of steaming tea as he nodded in greeting, resisting the urge to smile at the sight of their small, furry leader, a difficult feat for even him, before speaking calmly over the laughter.
I was unaware you were holding auditions for the Bat Circus, Master Dick.
He gave Dick a very pointed raised eyebrow, who in turn stopped laughing immediately, in an attempt to look properly abashed. Duke grinned as Jason took one last photo.
Oh, this goes beyond entertainment, Alfred. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I mean, how often does one get to dress up the giant bat of Gotham, like a tiny furry cosplayer?
Bruce squirmed a little more in Damien's grasp. He seemed more annoyed than anything, rubbing his wing against his face in an attempt to dislodge the cowl with a few huffs. Dick managed to compose himself by shoving a fist in his mouth to muffle his giggles.
Sorry, You look so grumpy, and the little cape is so cute.
He was fighting back a grin, but the laughter was threatening to bubble up again. Damien rolled his eyes, clutching the bat Bruce more securely, even as the fuzzy vigilante continued to try to free himself.
You act like this is a joke, but I think he looks more fearsome than usual.
Cass had been observing with a smile, though eventually she said,
He's done. Take it off.
She had been keeping a note of Bruce's comfortability levels. Jason sighed dramatically, but carefully leaned over to lift the tiny cowl off. "Buzzkill," he muttered affectionately at Cass, who only smirked in response as Bruce Bat immediately stopped fidgeting and settled back into Damien's arms with an exhausted little chirp. Dick wiped his eyes, still breathless from laughter, before giving Bruce a soft pat between the ears.
Okay, fine. We'll stop torturing him for now.
Though Tim was already discussing potential bat-sized boots in the background. It was then that Alfred cleared his throat calmly, and nodded towards the hall.
We have a few guests. Some members of Master Bruce's team were wanting to visit.
Dick perked up at the news, before nodding briskly.
Let him in, Al.
He was already straightening up, dusting the bat fur from his clothes, and running a hand through his hair out of ingrained habit. It was just his former teammates, sure, but he still felt compelled to not look like a mess. Jason, meanwhile, had shoved his phone in his pocket and straightened up immediately, the familiar signs of tension returning to the line of his shoulders. He would never admit it, but he was feeling a bit overprotective about his adopted father turned bat. The guy was vulnerable like this, after all, and judging by the way Damien scowled and held Bruce closer against himself, he shared the sentiment. Alfred inclined his head before going to open the door, speaking softly in an invitation and letting in Diana, Oliver, Barry, and Clark. Clark's face instantly lit up when he entered the room, and it would have been comical how quickly he zipped over to Bruce in a blur, were it not for Dick and Jason's almost automatic tensing at how the Kryptonian made a beeline straight for their vulnerable bat-father. Dick was the first to recover from the surprise, forcing a smile as he held out a hand to shake for Barry and Oliver, and a hug for Diana.
Great to see you guys. Been a while since you've come to the manor.
Duke and Cass absently went to grab some chairs from the side of the room, Tim putting on some music with a couple taps of his phone. Bruce, at least, hadn't seemed bothered by Clark's sudden appearance. If anything, the bat just outstretched his wing and tried to crawl onto the Kryptonian.
Yeah, well, couldn't miss the opportunity to see Batman Gone Wild,
Oliver joked.
I missed the chance to see him at the battle. It was a hell of a scene,
Barry piped up, watching Bruce Bat clamber happily into Clark's arms with a mixture of amusement and concern.
Real scary at first. We thought he got vaporized.
Dick and a couple of the others cringed, but Dick eased off the image with humor.
You just wanted to see B in his most cute form ever, so you could take endless pictures and use them as blackmail. Don't lie, Oliver.
Oliver grinned toothily.
Maybe. Can I?
He asked as he brought out his phone. Bruce had climbed Clark and was currently trying to groom his hair, Damien explaining loudly why Clark should consider this an honor when the Kryptonian had made a face about the drool. Diana hummed as she went over to Jason, loosely hugging him and ruffling his hair. They had always been close. Diana had taken to Jason when he was a little Robin, and still maintained their relationship even after his resurrection.
How are you holding up, Jason?
It probably came as a scare before Zatanna and John confirmed they could change him back. Jason shrugged nonchalantly and melted under her affection, as he always did. He had always been starstruck by Wonder Woman, and the fact that she still treated him like a member of the family warmed him, even as he kept his expression neutral.
I'll believe Bruce is going back to normal when he's back to his annoying, grumpy-ass self,
he muttered half-jokingly.
But it's easier, knowing he's not just stuck like this forever.
Diana hummed, pulling from the hug and nodding. John and Hal are out with a small team gathering the last ingredients. They will return by the end of the week, she promised. Barry snorted.
But hey, at least that means you get to hang out with this little dude more. Hey, Bruce, it's me, Barry, your favorite.
He was cooing to the bat, who promptly bit his finger when he tried to pet him. Jason threw his head back with a bark of laughter, practically cackling as Barry yelped and snatched his hand back, shaking it out like he'd been burned.
Oh, that's beautiful. Still got the bite of justice even when he's tiny.
Dick couldn't help but grin despite himself.
Should have known better than to stick your finger in Batman's face without warning.
He teased lightly, before nodding at Diana.
Thanks for checking in.
Oliver just sighed wistfully from where he was scrolling through the pictures Tim had sent him of the dress-up. Blackmail secured. I knew I should have brought some treats. Bruce was still clinging insistently to Clark, who had wisely decided not to complain about being used as a glorified bat perch, while Damien hovered nearby protectively, arms crossed over his chest like the proud little guard dog he was. That was, until Bruce started rubbing his head on Clark's hair in a very specific repetitive pattern, and Damien made a face.
Tuh, father is scenting Kent.
Duke blinked at that.
What does that mean?
He snorted as he came forward.
He is courting him,
Damien said scientifically. Clark went beet red instantly. Dick, who had just taken a sip of his coffee, choked violently, nearly spitting it out in a spectacular spray. Jason looked like he was about to pass away from sheer amusement, doubled over wheezing as Barry blinked between them with a quiet, "What?" Oliver almost dropped his phone. Tim, meanwhile, had frozen mid-step on his way to grab more snacks, mouth hanging open slightly, like he was rapidly questioning every single interaction Clark and Bruce had ever shared.
Oh my god.
Diana and Cass both looked unsurprised. Cass just nodded, like she'd expected that, while Diana laughed heartily. Ah, so being a creature makes him more open to his feelings. Lucky day, Clark. Damien nodded vigorously, clearly delighted to feel more knowledgeable than the others.
Father is emitting oil from the scent glands on his face and neck. He rubs them against the hair on Kent's head, marking him with his own scent.
Duke was still staring at the blushing Clark, like he didn't know how to react. When Dick finally managed to find his voice, with one hand clutching the back of a coffee table, voice strained.
Are you completely sure that's what's going on? You're not, exaggerating?
Clark looked like he was short-circuiting, his hands hovering awkwardly over Bruce, who, blissfully unaware of the emotional destruction he was wreaking, continued rubbing his head on Clark's hair with tiny back grunts of satisfaction. Jason wheezed out
"This is the greatest day of my life,"
between gasps for air, while Dick was still coughing from coffee inhalation, one hand raised in helpless surrender.
What? Bruce, B, stop. This is worse than when you flirted with Selena in front of us as kids,
he hissed.
I mean, we all obviously know.
He ignored Clark's protested noise.
But still, PDA.
Damien just gave a long, suffering sigh before reaching over to try and detach Bruce from Clark's person. Bruce had allowed it, though seemed displeased, trying to wriggle away from Damien and back to Clark, until Damien put him on one of those ceiling perches across the room. Bruce promptly tried to beeline it straight back to Clark.
Oh my god, does this mean that Batman has a little crush on our Boy Scout?
Oliver cackled to Barry. Dick buried his face in his hands.
This is worse than the time he got drunk at that Christmas gala and called Clark the sexiest reporter in the room. At least then, he was just playing the Brucey role. I'm starting to think he was serious.
Jason was still laughing so hard that Cass had to lightly smack him on the back before he passed out from lack of oxygen. Meanwhile, Tim, dead-eyed, had already pulled up some old mission files.
Oh my god, my theories were right.
Clark looked like he was trying very hard to become one with the Manor's wallpaper, face burning red as Bruce Bat flapped dramatically back toward him, only for Damien to catch him midair again.
I don't think we should read too much into this.
His voice cracked spectacularly. Oliver wiped tears from his eyes as Barry wheezed next to him, both utterly delighted. This is going to be a villain origin story if you break Batman's tiny furry heart now, Barry managed between snorts. Diana was the one to catch Bruce this time when he attempted to fly to Clark again. The bat quickly distracted as she began feeding him some figs from the cart nearby. I honestly do not understand the surprise. The two are hopelessly in love. Lois comments on it constantly. Damien tilted his head back and forth.
This is true. When I last went over to visit John, she stated that she wished it were possible for Kent Sr. to marry two individuals.
Jason was choking on more laughter. Hands braced on his knees as he wheezed, eyes streaming tears. Dick was trying, and failing, to maintain a straight face, his own lips twitching with the effort. Even Tim looked up from where he was scrolling through the files on his tablet, fascinated. Clark looked as if he'd rather disappear into the wallpaper at that point, a strangled noise escaping him as he buried his head in his hands. That's not what she meant, he protested weakly, face blazing in mortification. We're just very close best friends. Cass reached to pat Clark's shoulder sympathetically, but even she couldn't resist teasing.
It is legal now. Gay marriage,
she assured.
Why am I being ganged up on by the Wayne family about my love life?
Clark's voice cracked even higher, his hands flailing in despair, before he buried his face back into them. Oh my God, I think I can hear Lois laughing at me from Metropolis. He could. Oliver had texted her. Jason, still wheezing like a dying seal, managed to choke out. You say that like it's a bad thing. He clapped Clark on the shoulder with far too much enthusiasm for how wrecked he sounded from laughter, his grin vicious. Come on, Soups, admit it. You've imagined the Wayne Kent hyphenated last name on your mailbox at least once. Oliver was gasping for air besides Barry at this point, while Tim quietly sent an emergency text to Zatanna that said only, "We need you to turn Bruce back right now, before we have a Kryptonian heart attack." Clark ended up flying away when Oliver started making comments on the logistics of kissing a literal bat. And that is the end of Chapter 3. Now, on to Chapter 4. The visit ended soon enough. Bruce ended up sleeping on one of his perches for the rest of the day, tired out after all that interaction. Alfred stayed to watch him while the others patrolled. By the time they got back, the Batmobile rolling to a stop, and Jason and Tim on their bikes behind it, Alfred was currently sitting in the cave, loosely sipping at some tea as he watched Bruce fly around the cavernous ceilings. Dick yawned as he peeled off his domino, tossing it onto the Batcomputer's console with a quiet thud. He looks happy. He stretched his arms overhead before glancing up at where Bruce was doing lazy loops, clearly enjoying the freedom of flight. Jason kicked off his helmet before dropping it onto one of the chairs with an exhausted groan. Oi, Alfie, did you just watch him fly around like some kind of live stream all night? Because I know you did not get any sleep. Alfred took another measured sip of tea, not even glancing away from Bruce's graceful arc through the cave's stalactites. One does what one must for their charge's enrichment. His dry tone suggested he found this vastly more enjoyable than any late-night book would have been. Bruce seemed very content to fly down once he saw the others, landing on Cass's back to chitter at her and climb around with excitement. It was taking Nocturnal to a whole new level. A smile crossed Cass's face at his excitement, the young woman running a gentle hand over his tiny head as she leaned back against the Batcomputer. Tim collapsed into one of the computer chairs next to her with a sigh, pulling off his cowl and raking a hand through his messy hair. God, I'm exhausted, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Dick nodded sympathetically, already shedding parts of his suit and throwing them haphazardly on the ground. I know, it seems like every two-bit crook and wannabe gangbanger in Gotham had a death wish tonight. Jason cracked his neck as he settled by Alfred, a hand resting on the back of the chair behind the butler. Feels like it was a lot more work for such basic goons, though.
Tch, of course it was. Father was not present,
Damien muttered. The teen sent a glance at Bruce, a mix between something sour, sad, and angry, before turning heel and promptly walking towards the showers. It seemed he was over the intrigue of having a bat instead of a dad. Dick exhaled through his nose, watching Damien go, that same old helpless feeling creeping up on him again. They were all running on fumes. The mission didn't stop just because Bruce was temporarily out of commission. Or, in this case, furry vacation. Jason leaned back in his chair with a dry snort. "Kid's got a point," he muttered, scrubbing at the dried blood on his knuckles absently. "B usually scares off half the idiots before they even think about pulling shit." Cass let out a quiet sigh and nudged Bruce back towards Dick with an encouraging little gesture, like she knew he needed something to focus on besides the exhaustion gnawing at them all. And sure enough, Bruce happily flopped over to cling onto Dick's shoulder, like an affectionate living scarf. Tim looked up from where he was typing one-handed into the back computer, the other hand holding an energy drink like it was life support. "Jean should be back tomorrow with the last ingredient Z needed," he offered quietly in reassurance. "I believe young Master Damien simply misses his father," Alfred said calmly. "As we all do." A silence fell over the cave then, each of them mulling that over and all the implications beneath. Tim glanced again at the direction Damien had stormed off at. A small scrunch edged into his forehead. Dick reached up to gently scratch behind Bruce's tiny ears, his throat suddenly very tight. "Yeah." Jason looked away sharply, his jaw working like he was biting back something raw, before he forced a smirk instead. "Speak for yourself. I'm thriving with the batless patrols." His tone was too light, too brittle to be genuine. Cass exhaled through her nose, her hands moving in small, weary gestures.
"We need him back soon,"
Alfred hummed.
"Perhaps tomorrow," he agreed. "I take it you are all spending the night in the hammocks again?"
Dick nodded before his exhaustion finally caught up with him. He nearly tripped over his own discarded cape as he shuffled towards the makeshift sleep area.
"Oh, definitely,"
he yawned, voice muffled.
"He tries to cuddle into our hair when we're asleep, and honestly, worth every second of cricked necks tomorrow."
They made their way up to the sunroom, all crowded in the elevator, other than Cass, who had stayed behind to wait for Damien. Jason groaned, but still followed, until they were in the room and he was shedding layers of armor, down to just a tank top and sweatpants. He flopped unceremoniously into one of the hammocks. "If you tell anyone I'm willingly participating in this bat-themed slumber party, I will deny it." Tim was barely conscious enough to crawl in next, one arm draped over his face. Alfred had taken Bruce and set him on one of the ceiling posts absently, watching as he began the now familiar click, click, click of his walking. "Good night," he called softly into the room, before turning the light off. Damien and Cass ended up camping out elsewhere for the night. Damien couldn't look at the bat for the moment. Day 6. The pups had been stiller than usual. Bruce wasn't sure why. It was cold season, but where they were was perfectly warm. He didn't like it. Lunch was solemn. As cute as Bruce was as a bat, everyone was missing him as a human dearly. Alfred served a comforting meal of soup and grilled cheese, though eyed Bruce's empty seat with subtle glances. Jason stirred his soup absently, staring into the broth like it held answers. "How did he even manage to get hit? Kind of a fucking noob move," he muttered. Dick sighed and leaned back in his chair, pushing his half-eaten sandwich away. He knew what Jason really meant.
"Yeah, I miss him too. I dreamt about him yelling at us for skipping patrol reports last night."
Even Tim, who was usually buried in files or casework, was just sitting there, picking at a crust of bread with restless fingers, before sighing and tossing it onto the plate. The cave had been too quiet all morning, without Bruce's usual grumbling presence, dictating orders or chastising reckless behavior. Alfred cleared his throat after a long pause, straightening slightly as if pulling himself together through sheer willpower alone. He refilled their drinks, before glancing towards where Bruce's bat was currently hanging upside down from one of the ceiling posts, as bats do. Perhaps tonight will be the night. His voice didn't waver, even though they all knew what that really meant. We can't keep doing this much longer. Damien, meanwhile, finally came down for food, having been holed up in his room most of the day. He made no comment, but he was wearing the Batman cape, more of a glorified, oversized blanket on him. He really missed Bruce. He ended up sitting next to Dick, scowling at his plate as Alfred filled it with grilled cheese and a bowl of tofu miso. Dick watched his little brother out of the corner of his eye, not commenting on his chosen attire, but the small, sympathetic half-smile that quirked on his face was enough. Bruce had always been a source of security for the younger members of the family, even if they wouldn't readily admit it until they were older. He was their rock. The whole team was just off-kilter without their leader, and Damien probably felt it the most keenly. He moved to carefully place a gentle hand on top of Damien's head, rubbing gently to mimic the tender moments Bruce always gave out.
Hey, kiddo.
Damien's eyes went half-lidded, and then slowly he slumped against the chair.
Has there been word?
He mumbled, scooping and spilling his soup back into the bowl with his spoon. Dick's expression tightened at the reminder. His hand stilled in Damien's dark hair. He didn't want to lie to Damien, but he also didn't want the kid to give up hope.
We're waiting on John,
he explained with a heavy exhale, letting his hand fall away so he could take a half-hearted bite out of his grilled cheese.
Should be any minute now.
Damien nodded slowly, going to reluctantly eat as well. Above them, Bruce squeaked and flapped a bit, before swooping down to land on Tim's slumped form. It was as if the bat sensed the tension in the room, wings wrapped broadly around Tim's shoulders and nudging at him with a wet nose. Tim startled slightly when Bruce landed, his entire posture stiffening before the warmth of those wings settled around him like some kind of bizarre living weighted blanket. He hesitated for only a second, before exhaling sharply through his nose and leaning just a little bit closer into it, eyes fluttering shut as Bruce Bat clung to him in what could only be interpreted as comfort.
Thanks, B,
Tim mumbled quietly, not caring if anyone heard. Jason watched the whole thing from his seat, with an expression caught between exasperation and reluctant amusement.
Oh my God,
he muttered under his breath.
We are all so emotionally compromised right now.
Damien frowned.
I like Father better as a human,
he mumbled in agreement. And it was then that there was a poof of smoke, both Constantine and Zatanna appearing in the dining room. Jason's chair screeched backward violently as he shot to his feet, his entire body rigid with tension.
Fucking warn a guy next time, you goth-looking bastard.
Tim hadn't even flinched, a miracle given how tightly wound he was, his hand automatically moving to keep Bruce Bat from falling off his shoulder from panic at the sudden arrival. Dick had gone from slumped exhaustion to full-on hopeful and half a second flat, eyes darting between Zatanna and Constantine like they held salvation in their hands.
You got it?
His voice came out quieter than intended, raw with something like desperation. Zatanna held up an ornate vial filled with swirling silver liquid that seemed to glow faintly under the manor's warm lighting. Her expression was tired but triumphant as she tossed it once in her palm before catching it neatly again. Got what we needed. She nodded towards where Bruce currently clung awkwardly to Tim's shoulder, like some kind of furry backpack of comfort. One Batman coming up. Constantine moved forward.
That bastard better be grateful. Had to call in favours,
he muttered, going to try and grab Bruce. Bruce, as usual, did not seem so keen about Constantine, flapping in alarm and scrabbling a little bit. Zatanna sighed dramatically before holding out a single gloved hand to stop John from advancing further. I swear to God, you have the finesse of a drunk bull. Back up before he bites you again. Bruce Bat had already ducked halfway behind Tim's head in clear distrust, his tiny claws clutching onto strands of black hair for dear life, while his golden eyes narrowed into slits at Constantine. A low, warning chitter escaped him.
Try it. I dare you.
Tim winced as Bruce's claws unintentionally yanked on his scalp, but didn't move, too wary of spooking him further now that their solution was finally here.
Yeah, maybe let Z handle this one.
He gritted out through clenched teeth while trying and failing to gently pry Bruce's grip loose from his hair without causing more damage. Dick snorted and stood quickly, circling around behind them both with careful hands outstretched, like someone coaxing a feral cat down from a tree branch.
Easy, B. Come on now, don't scar Timmy.
Bruce let Dick pick him up, wings wrapping around himself tightly in offense. Constantine scoffed.
I pick him up slightly wrong one time, and he acts like I'm the goddamn devil. I don't look anything like Lucifer.
Stop rambling, Damien bit out. We need to fix Father.
Constantine scoffed at Damien, but shut up anyway, opting instead to watch in tense silence as Dick carefully cradled Bruce Bat against his chest, hands smoothing over the bat wings gingerly. Dick felt his heart racing wildly from a potent combination of excitement and nerves, because this was it. This was finally it. After all those sleepless and exhausting days, after all those endless patrols and restless nights, after all that waiting, the end of this nightmare was right there, in the form of gleaming silver in Zatanna's palm.
Perhaps the cave would be the best place to perform this ritual,
Alfred noted dutifully.
Is there anything I should prepare for his return, Miss Zatanna?
Zatanna shook her head, already moving toward the hallway.
Just space and silence,
she said, tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, as she cast a glance back at Constantine, who was still grumbling under his breath about ungrateful bats and their personal vendettas. Tim was already texting Cass, likely to let her know that they were heading down for the big moment. Dick cradled Bruce Bat closer, pressing his forehead briefly against a tiny bat head in a silent reassurance before following after Zatanna.
Let's get our dad back.
Cass was already waiting in the cave when they had arrived. She'd been training, and as she saw the others, a look of relief sparked in her eyes.
It's here?
Damien huffed.
Yes, they have made the potion. Finally.
Constantine grumbled.
Your daddy's fault for getting zapped in the first place.
Alfred led Zatanna to a larger open space of the cave to allow her to begin preparations. Dick carefully passed Bruce Bat over to Zatanna, his hands lingering just a second too long, like he was reluctant to let go, even now. The cave was eerily silent as she began tracing an intricate circle in chalk across the stone floor, murmuring in Latin under her breath. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough that even Jason wasn't cracking jokes for once, just standing there with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, jaw clenched. Tim hovered near Damien's shoulder, while Cass remained perfectly still by Alfred's side, dark eyes tracking every movement like this whole scene could shatter at any moment. Zatanna finally straightened up after pouring the vial into a small silver bowl at the center of the circle. "All right," she said slowly, glancing around at all of them, before settling her gaze on Bruce currently curled in her arm. "This might be painful," Constantine grunted.
Just get it over with. Bats won't scream.
He leaned to press a hand on Bruce's head.
You're thirsty,
he said, his voice echoing with hypnotism. And then Zatanna was setting Bruce down, and the bat practically scrambled to drink the potion.
Stay back,
Constantine warned.
Don't touch him while he's changing, or you'll risk him forming wrong. Understood?
He eyed each of the kids in turn. Damien, in particular, looked like he wanted nothing more than to reach out and grab his father's arm for reassurance, but he knew better than to argue with Constantine's warning, so he just nodded stiffly, watching with wide eyes and holding the cape closer around himself. And as Bruce had drunk the potion in its full, a few last swipes of a bat tongue over the bowl, he suddenly stilled, and then violently started squirming, flapping and contorting and screeching in what was clear agony, especially when his limbs and body began to lengthen in what could only be described as body horror. Tim flinched and had to turn his head sharply away as soon as he realized Bruce was shaking and spasming under his skin. Even Jason, ever fearless, looked a little sick, his lips twisting down at the gruesome sight, while Cass hid her face against Alfred's shoulder, fingers clutching at his sleeve like a lifeline. It was less about the gore and more about wanting to help. Dick almost surged forward to help, but held himself back at the last second at Constantine's warning reminder. "Don't move." "It'll pass," Zatanna added with a grim expression. "His body is very literally changing at a cellular level." As she spoke, the bat's form only twisted more, human arms beginning to form along the wings, legs stretching, body losing fur in favor of a familiar muscular body. As Bruce's facial features, half morphed and bat-like, began to form, the screeching stopped. It was replaced by gritted teeth and Bruce bracing himself against the grounds, on his hands and knees, refusing to scream the second his mental facilities had even slightly returned. And then, as the last of the leathery skin faded away, and Bruce, pink and raw-looking, finally turned to himself, the man, naked, exhausted, but Bruce, collapsed onto his side with a low, involuntary grunt. Dick was on him in seconds, sliding onto his knees beside Bruce with frantic hands. He immediately set to checking for injuries, temperature, anything that might still be wrong.
"Bruce, oh my God, B, talk to me."
His voice shook under the weight of so much relief he could barely hold himself steady. Jason stayed back, just long enough to grab the cape from Damien's shoulders, and rushed to hand it to Dick.
"Get him decent before he traumatizes us even more."
Tim had already shoved past Damien, who was watching in emotional overload, and was hovering over Bruce's other side, like he couldn't decide whether to help Dick fuss over him or just start crying right there on the spot. And then Alfred stepped forward, after carefully passing Cass off to Constantine's surprisingly steady grip, kneeling down next to his oldest charge with eyes full of unspoken emotion, as he placed a gentle hand against Bruce's shoulder and murmured,
"Welcome back, Master Bruce."
Bruce, wrapped in the cape and being fussed over by Dick, who was currently hugging him tightly and rambling, plus yelled at by Jason, a lecture about magic safety training disguising his relief, looked up at Alfred with a dazed blink. And then he was sagging, passing out from the strain of the change, but stable. Constantine sighed.
"Bloody dramatic bastard. We can move him. He still needs time to unmush his brain."
Dick was openly crying at this point, still hugging Bruce with his face buried against his hair, shoulders shaking as he just breathed. It was like all the stress and tension left him all at once, leaving him drained and exhausted, but too relieved to care. He was alive. Alive, human. Jason whipped his head up before promptly kicking Constantine's shin as he moved away from where Bruce was now slumped safely in Dick's hold.
"Call my father dramatic one more time. I dare you."
Ow! Cass hesitantly stepped forward to press her forehead against Bruce's temple for just a second before murmuring, "Sleep now. Celebrate later." Alfred exhaled deeply before nodding once and moving to help Dick lift him properly toward the medbay cot nearby, where no doubt they were all going to be crowding around him within minutes, despite Constantine's grumbling protests about giving the man space. Damien was already pulling blankets from seemingly nowhere, with an expression caught between scowling and sheer relief, as he practically threw them over his father's still pale form, while muttering under his breath about idiotic sorcerers and reckless behavior. "Did we miss it? Is he normal?" Steph yelled as she and Duke made it down the stairs. It was over. Finally, blessedly over. Day 7. Bruce woke to a warm weight on his chest. Warm Everything felt hazy and fuzzy and calm, which caused him mild alarm, as he felt almost drugged. But being back to Bruce, human, and not Bruce Bat, he didn't let it show, just slowly opened his eyes, controlled breathing, and was immediately met with the sight of his children, all piled on top of him in his bed. Bruce blinked once, twice, just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating, or still a bat. But no. Dick was draped across his chest, one arm thrown possessively around his shoulders, while the other was tangled in Damien's hair, who had ended up curled against Bruce's side, tucked under the cape that was now resting on them like a blanket. Bruce in pajamas. Tim was pressed against Bruce's other shoulder, face smushed into the blankets with his hand gripping Bruce's shirt, like he expected him to vanish at any second. Jason was sprawled haphazardly at the foot of the bed, head pillowed on Bruce's shins, as if they were some kind of glorified footrest, while Cass occupied whatever tiny space remained by nestling between Dick and Damien, with her fingers knotted loosely in Tim's sleeve. Duke was draped in a nearby cot, with Steph curled around him and snoring. Even Alfred hadn't escaped the family pile-up. He sat in a chair beside the bed, with one hand resting on Bruce's forearm, as he dozed lightly, his back still straight despite sleep. The surrounding shield, because really, that's what this was, made Bruce calm significantly. The question was, how had he gotten here? He tipped his head back to look at the ceiling, fingers idly combing through Dick's hair. The ceiling that...
They really should be up there. It was safer, to be honest.
What? Bruce grunted slightly.
Alfred.
Alfred startled slightly awake at Bruce's voice, one of the few times in recent memory he'd been caught actually napping, before blinking rapidly to adjust his vision.
Ah.
His voice was quieter than usual, laced with something between exhaustion and sheer relief, as he straightened just a touch.
You are awake, sir. Any pain?
Bruce frowned, because, no, that wasn't the issue right now. The issue was that his thoughts still felt off, hazy in a way they never were before. Like part of him hadn't fully readjusted to human cognition yet, and kept flickering back to instinctual bat logic without warning. He ignored how part of him wanted nothing more than to crawl into some dark corner and nest for an hour. Instead, he swallowed hard before rasping out,
How long?
6 days, Father.
Damien mumbled from where he was buried under the cape, laying on top of Bruce.
You are a magnificent specimen, but it is better that you are human again.
His grip tightened in Bruce's shirt. Bruce blinked, because 6 days was a disturbingly long time to be stuck in an entirely different form, but didn't get the chance to voice his concern, before Dick immediately shifted closer, tightening his grip around Bruce's torso, like he was seconds from getting dragged away by some unseen force.
You were so small.
Dick whispered into his collarbone, voice half muffled but still painfully raw.
And scared, we thought.
He cut himself off sharply, burying deeper against Bruce, as if that would erase the memory of those terrified, buggy eyes staring up at them with all primal fear. Jason scoffed from where he was still draped over Bruce's leg, like an ill-tempered cat.
Speak for yourself. I thought you looked ridiculous.
But even he didn't pull away when Bruce absently nudged a foot against his ribs in silent reassurance. Cass nodded in agreement.
Bat brain,
she said simply, rubbing Tim's arm, who was getting a bit emotional again against Bruce's shoulder. The third eldest gave a watery laugh against Bruce's arm, but it was broken halfway by a quiet, shuddering inhale that was probably intended to be a silent sob. Bruce shifted his grip on him with a sigh, tugging him up to sit against his shoulder so he could run a gentle hand through the kid's sleep-mused hair. Tim's only protests to the manhandling were a quiet groan and a pitiful sniff, burying his face into the crook of Bruce's neck, like the touched, starved, clingy kid he was.
You were so freaky.
Tim's being a drama queen.
Steph mumbled sleepily from the other bed.
You were a cutie.
Duke snorted.
Other than the mealworm moments. Was kinda gross.
Bruce stared at them all blankly.
I don't have a recollection,
he muttered. Damien lifted his head to look at Bruce with a scowl.
You only need to know you are banned from apocalypses pertaining to magic. Clearly, you are too incompetent to not be nearly erased.
I was worried. I missed you. Bruce huffed. He knew exactly what Damien was really saying under all that prickly defensiveness, and had half a mind to retort back. Instead, he just squeezed the kid's shoulder lightly before murmuring,
Noted.
He let his head fall back against the pillow.
Glad to be back.
Jason scoffed from his spot at Bruce's feet, still not moving despite having plenty of room to sprawl elsewhere.
Yeah, we missed you too, or whatever.
He rolled his eyes for good measure, before elbowing Tim in the legs, gently.
Quit leaking on B's shirt already, Timbit.
Tim sniffled again, but didn't argue beyond flipping Jason off half-heartedly from Bruce's side. Cass hummed from her spot against Dick's shoulder. Dad's back. Alfred let out a long, suffering sigh, as if this entire scene physically pained him, but made no move to disrupt it either. Instead, he simply adjusted one of the blankets higher over Bruce's leg with a quiet, Rest well, Master Bruce. And as Bruce dozed back off, mumbling something about having a strange craving for figs, the group stayed together, safe, sound, and human. Bruce had a craving for figs months after. And that is the end of FruitBat. There's no author's notes, so on to reader's notes.
Hi, Editing V here. I just wanted to say thank you guys for 100 subscribers, which this has taken me so long to edit and record that I am now on to 200 subscribers. So thank you guys for that as well. Yeah, I'm really thankful for all the support you guys have shown me. Yeah, a little bit about this fic. It's 4 chapters, but I just switched it into one because why not? Give you guys a big treat. My editing app was fighting me on this last bit. I ended up having to export it and then do the last chapter, add it on, because my editing app was like, no. And for some reason, chapter 4, when I was recording it, it just ended up quieter. And it also corrupted a little bit. Like some bits, it was, there were some weird click bits, which I don't know what happened there. It must have corrupted, but oh well. But yeah, I want to say thank you again, and thanks for listening. Bye!